Recording is in progress. Thank you, Phyllis. Isn't that the woman's voice that they used for years? Was the Phyllis from the phone company? That's right. Thank you.
All right. Welcome to TISCA. This is the June event. We have been on a little bit of hiatus since having our conference back in March. We took a couple months off. We've had COVID come around. We've had deaths in the family. We've had busy personal lives. We've had busy work lives, and it's been all over the place. But it came to be June, and it has become a tradition that we have an anniversary edition every June where we have Mark Tomlinson come. Mark is a longtime TISCA fan and TISCA participant, and TISCA loves Mark as much as I hope that Mark loves TISCA.
It's on a tree, but if someone can go out on a tree somewhere and carve it small, you don't want to damage the tree. But, that little, that'll work.
Some sort of indelible ink.
Sort of, yeah, exactly.
Mark introduced me to the term of continuous performance testing, and so I've been a fan ever since. Yeah. He's got a huge long bio on Meetup, but what I want to say is he's an expert at what he does here. He's the host of Perf Bites, a podcast with Leandro, who does the Perf Bites Espanol. And so it's so great to have you guys as part of our community, helping to bring up the ThoughtWorks and also to laugh. My favorite is always when there are performance bombs in the world where people fall down over their performance problems. I love to share those with you. So, Mark, thank you for being here with us tonight. I asked, because it was one of my favorite tools, and because we've had an effort recently in my teams to do some load testing. So I specifically solicited the topic of JMeter because I knew you'd be as excited about it as me.
You've conjured it from the air.
There's nothing like an open source tool that's as powerful.
Come forth, spirit, and share with us. JMeter. I know it. I can feel it.
All right. True. So tell us what you got to say. How do you want to roll tonight?
It's really loose, mostly because it starts to get warm, especially when you're further south. I'm here in Philadelphia, and it's kind of muggy, but it's nice and cool at home here. But I did throw out on the meetup, if people had topics, the real, when you're learning like the introduction course, which for a lot of my work, I like teaching the intro, like intro to load testing, intro to JMeter or a tool load runner, because one, it's easy to teach only because you're really putting foundational skills together, and you can keep the curriculum pretty straightforward. And then you can see who is going to really launch with the tool. And then they come back for an intermediate class or an advanced class. So the more we do more advanced classes or just talking about advanced stuff, it always devolves into hey, I have this idea. Can you show me? And fill in the blanks. So tonight, use the chat. If you just have any idea at any level, just because I'll try to do the best I can to answer it. Between JMeter or just anything you guys want to go. I did ask on the meetup if people wanted to send me some topics. Nobody sent in any topics. So I'm not really a shaming kind of person, but it's not too late because I am a sentient human being and this is a real-time interaction. I'm not like some online Udemy course where you're like, I just watched this talking head go on. And I'm not a talking head because we can switch cameras. And I can do, love, TSQ.
Oh, you did it. Yay.
Every single time. So we're going to have fun. I'll actually sketch some things out and some answers for you. The slides will be pretty minimal, and I'm going to try, cross my fingers, do everything on a live demo. If I go over to where that live demo screen was, there it is. Okay. So yeah. So if you do have things in the chat that are bugging you, if you're getting started with JMeter, even just let it roll, and I'll try to help as much as I can. But I do have some agenda items to go through that we'll cover that I think most people are like, I'm using JMeter, but how do I do the next level? How do I take the next step? Where do I do this kind of stuff? Okay. Yeah. And it's great to be back with the TISCA crowd because you guys are such a great community and good for you guys. So yeah. Are you ready to roll?
I'm ready. I'm ready when you are.
All right, we're going to try to do this thing that we did before I did the thing of the thing. Wasn't it shift that?
I'm a little nervous. See the number 2. All right, we're doing it.
Ready?
Yeah.
How's that?
I see slides.
Woohoo! All right, I'm going to try to move these things over out of the way so I can see. I have the chat, just so you know, I have the chat open to the side and I have the slides open to the side. And this is my purple background to match the purple background, because if you don't have a purple background, you don't have a purple background, and you could change that in your life. As Susan said, I'm first and foremost, I'm just a performance tester. A performance architect is now the title they give me when they can't give you shit tons of money. They will give you, hey, here's a wonderful title. That's great. I'm fine with that. It's totally cool. But I am a performance architect. And this week of all weeks was the first week someone at my company turned and said, hey, I've never worked at a company that had a performance architect. And he sort of sounded like Beavis and Butthead. He said performance architect. And I thought it was really funny. Anyway, we do the podcast on Fridays. I've been doing on YouTube for the past 6 months, one bit of the Perf Bites, just YouTube tips and tricks. The last one I did was on like ETL, batch performance and stuff like that. I've covered some of the continuous topics that Susan's talked about. And we've talked about other sort of mindset things or cool tools or tips and tricks. So tune in on Fridays for that. Leandro, we have tons of other stuff we're working on in the Perf Bites world. So, and I'm going to make a reference. I'll give a shout out to some JMeter friends, only because they deserve the props for a lot of what you might be using in JMeter today is from a company called Abstracta. And Abstracta is from Ecuador, Uruguay. It's Federico and Roger and these guys that if you use BlazeMeter, which is a JMeter tool, we'll talk a little bit about what they have called a Java DSL for JMeter. And that's kind of when you really get tired of working with the JMeter GUI, you'll go there. So you might want to check out, I have a link for you to their GitHub, which is Abstracta. And they are the brains behind a lot of the contributions to JMeter in the last 10 years. And they're a cool bunch of folks. So, so today's agenda, I just want to talk generally about advancing your JMeter game and things that have nothing to do with JMeter in particular. I do want to dig in a little bit, also nothing to do with JMeter, but maybe talk a little bit about the JVM and what's happened with the G1 garbage collector that has benefited load testing with a Java-based engine so completely. Uruguay. Thank you, Susan. That's nice. And then I want to dig in. I'll do the hands-on. We'll go and actually look at some of my scripts, my test harness, the stuff that I use every day. And I want to cover things about modules and thread groups and scenarios and oh my, all sorts of different stuff. So how you can take a simple JMeter script and start making it more complex without losing your mind. Secondarily, command line parameters, which are an essential ingredient for taking JMeter from something you use attended to going unattended on your pipeline, and how to use command line parameters for the JMeter executable. There's lots of things about real-time monitoring, so I want to cover a little bit about evolutions in how to do real-time monitoring. And then our good friend Wilson Marr, for a long time, helped build a bunch of stuff for running JMeter in a Docker container. I don't personally do this, but I wanted to cover it a little bit. And I have a perf bits on that as well, which is pretty cool. And at the end, we'll take a view. I just do at the end, leaving towards the end, things that we can just tour together and maybe answer some questions on. So if that sounds like a good agenda, if you want to add something to this agenda, now is your chance right here in the chat session. Go for it. I'm all game. So let's say that you got started with JMeter and maybe you had functional test automation. There are people that do functional testing with JMeter. You can run it in what's called functional test mode, and it steps down your script and basically it'll run pass fail. You can put assertions in there and checkpoints, and you can actually use JMeter just to do functional testing. It will spit out results either in XML or in a CSV, and you can parse the output and you can put that into your test plan results tool. Have a nice day. But that's absolutely not what it was designed to do. But it is a free tool. And I say free because it's free like puppies. Like, oh, hey, I think I'll start using this Java program. Oh, does my company allow me to install Java on my machine? What version of Java do I install? Okay. What version of Java is supported? Okay, do I install the JVM or the whole JDK? Okay, great. And then there's all these plugins. So I take JMeter and I add all these plugins. So it's free like puppies because you will have overhead in those first few years. And once you make all that investment, you're like, wow, I actually know how to run this tool pretty well now. So I need to go to the next level. So the first thing that happens from your first scripts are usually a simple single thread group and a few samplers, and you can run a little bit of load, or you have the logic pieces that you could grow in there. And it's like, how do I do more complex load scenarios? Take e-commerce, for example. Let's say in e-commerce, all right, you guys ready? Wait a minute, I have to stop screen sharing and go back to that. Does this work? There I am. Let's say in e-commerce, a simple script, you can tell me if this is working or not. A simple script, actually, I can get rid of the L3. A simple script would be the test plan in JMeter to a thread group and sample 1 ABC. So very simple script. And then down here outside the test plan, you could put a listener, which would give you a report and maybe the visual tree. And these are sampler ABC in a simple, very, very simple way of doing things. As you expand and get to be more complex about how you're doing things, you'll say, what if I want to run 80% of the users do A, 15% of the users do B, and 5% of the users do C. So every time it iterates over that thread group, it goes into what I call a mixer. And I can show you guys how I do that in about 3 different ways, and how JMeter can do that kind of stuff. And then if you expand that to say in that thread group, what if I have 4 different types of users? I have a procurement user, and I have an end user, and then I have a type Z user. With, I don't know, a zombie user, something like that. But you want to have a mix. So now of these 4, those are in procurement. Then you have an end user that only does 2 of those steps, and type Z only does 1, which is browsing. So you could end up with all this weird branching logic. How do I do that and still have JMeter run in some reasonable kind of way? And so look at how I'm getting really good at this. So I go to there, go to there, I go to there, I go to there. I share. I'm good. We're back here. Not bad. So if you need to run larger and more complex load scenarios, that's the first reason you want to invest in. You've been successful with JMeter to date, but you want to take the next step. The other thing is you're just doing more load testing frequently. So the ease of use in the tool, which can be cumbersome from a GUI perspective. How do I just save time? I want to run the same kind of things, but I want to run them differently, or I'm getting asked to do different scenarios, but even like I need to do it more often. I need to run this every night, or I'm doing some stuff manually and then I have some unattended at night. So you want to know how to actually get things running either in an unattended fashion or in a more flexible modular fashion. We'll cover some of that. The last thing I think is this continuous delivery and automation, where I think if, you know how we went through this thing in the industry where it said like, you need to be mobile first, or you need to be, you automate 100% and maybe you do some manual testing on the side, but you like automate first. I think that may be a good thing in JMeter, since performance testing generally absolutely is an automated tool. Like to do performance testing, you can't not be doing, you can't not, oh, where did that go? There we go. You can't not be doing some kind of automation to run load for the most part. So if you are thinking, I'm going to build a JMeter script, and you're thinking you're only going to open it and run it manually every time, that's probably not the good way to think about it. Thinking about it now by default is like, all right, how almost every first time I interview someone about, hey, we should talk about building a load test to run your thing. I'm like, all right, and then we're going to run this every day, right? And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, this is your baseline load testing test, and we're going to run it on every build. They're like, oh, cool. Their eyes light up. So this drudgery of I have to do performance testing because the preem put it on the plan, and I don't know, turns into this, wow, I'm excited. And that's what really makes our world go much easier, is if we can just be naturally excited about this stuff. I can get results all the time. oh, we'll catch stuff if suddenly the CPU is 10 times worse, on a Thursday. Being that it's Thursday, I just jinxed somewhere in the world just got a load test result, or they didn't get a load test result. Exactly. So getting into continuous automation, we'll talk a little bit about how to do that piece. And we already have some questions coming in. Let me go through the next piece about where are we? It's skipping a slide for me. Why is it doing that? I don't want it to do that.
Hey, we got a couple of questions floated in the chat. One was,
yeah, go for it.
Is there a way to validate that each iteration is being done correctly when you have to do a login? And whenever he says, whenever he does this type of scenario, he feels like he's not doing it right. So I just want to clarify, Eugene, do you mean that you want to have the login for these 4 different things to be containers for the things that are going into the mixer?
No, sorry, probably I did not express my question right. When I run like a type of load test or stress test, one of the scenarios I need to go to a login page. So I don't know if I have to put user and password. It's part of the flow. I do not. Sometimes I do not feel confident that every iteration it's doing the login correctly, so I'm not getting the correct results each time. So
right,
is there a way to validate that it's doing it or not? Because it's one of the scenarios that I not feel comfortable every time I'm doing a test, and sometimes I think that the results I'm getting are not 100% true because I'm not able to see like, yeah, this is what I'm getting.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hang on, let me go here, go there. And you now see the same slide, right? You're good?
Yes.
Beautiful. So Eugene, in that point, to your point in particular, the parameterizing of things, you want to go over that a little bit? I can show you how I do it and how I pull in different user IDs. And then if you need to reset the session, how do you reset that session using some of the other advanced configurations to make sure a session ID or anything, the connections themselves get completely truncated? Well, I can cover out how to do that as well. So let me make sure I have a note of that. And I'm gonna move this. That should be all right. I just truncated a slide, something screwed up on my slides. So thanks for bearing with me. What was the other question there, Susan? I think it was in the chat.
The other question is from David. Which part of the system are you load testing? The processor, the network, the DB access, the front end layer? Like, how do you distinguish what you're verifying?
Yeah. Let me come back to that at the end of this next little section, because David, I'll answer your question in the next piece. To Eugene, there's the iteration piece and the end of an iteration. I'll show you how I do modules and what happens on the last sampler in that set. With other protocols that are not web, you have to maybe be more explicit about how you terminate a session and then restart that session with either a new login or reusing of a login as well. So I'll cover that as well in one of the demos. So let me come back to that. Great questions. David, let's talk about JVM and G1 garbage collection for a very, very long time. And I mean like the first 10 years of JMeter, if you could say it's 10 years worth of JMeter, maybe the first 10, first maybe 8 to 10 years of JMeter. It was much like .NET running in 1.0 and 1.1 and the JVM running on JVM JRE 3, 4, 5. Then you start seeing things running all the way up, and everyone stopped like at Java 8. And there's tons of things stuck out there in Java 8 running on Java 8. And Java 8 did have early editions of what's called the G1 garbage collector. And there were some problems with early versions of JMeter prior to version 4. There wasn't really 4, but in the 3.2 era, there were some definite problems, mostly because the G1 garbage collector was not complete and it wasn't a very scalable engine. And if you would just let JMeter sit there and do some stuff, some of these plugins, it would eventually consume all its memory, not clean itself up, and crash. So one of the things you'll learn as an advanced JMeter user is which plugins or what kinds of code you now take into your hands the objects you're creating and managing. And I'll show you a bean shell sampler or Groovy written in a JavaScript sampler. But ultimately, my biggest recommendation as you take that, get onto the JVM 11, so the JRE 11, of course, Java has done even anything newer than that. 13, I think we're up to 18 now or something, right? So you don't need all of the development features. The JRE, for the most part, the runtime is what JMeter uses to run load. So, and how the G1 garbage collector more efficiently does, used to have to tune your own parallel GC. G1 garbage collector takes care of that for you. So it's a really, really, really nice, smart little piece of intelligent garbage collection world. I like it much more than what .NET has been doing. So that's one of the reasons I've stayed with JMeter as long as I have. So biggest recommendation, move to JVM 11. So you get more efficient or intelligent collections, more intelligent separations for parallel marks versus parallel sweeps. Every time you run an iteration in JMeter, and I run stuff up to the 5,000-6,000 transactions per second, and each one of those transactions per second is a sampler object, a sampler result. All of those objects are flooding through the memory buffers. So Eden being the first garbage collected generation, and then G1, G2, G3. Hence the G1 garbage collector is now that you've created your object, we have to figure out what to do with that object. And in load testing, that object may only hang around maybe less than 100 milliseconds. So you're like, all of the rules about garbage collection go out the window, because usually the JVM is a long running session, long running meaning many seconds for a single object to live before it gets marked, swept, disposed, and done. So that's the challenge that the G1 garbage collector does. As you'll see JMeter ramping up, all of a sudden you'll see garbage collection and the CPU actually come down a bit on the load generator, because the G1 GC is like, oh, you're doing that kind of load. I'll tune myself to make sure I'm doing that efficiently and cleaning up those objects. So big recommendation for your installed JMeter, be on a JRE version 11 or more, or newer as you do that. The latest and greatest versions, I think that the ones I'm running for JMeter is, I think, 5.4. Obviously, there was some security flaws and things like that. You want to work around those. What was that? I forget it was something with the logging, log4j issues, and another one. So they came out with the log4j fixes in that kind of, in JMeter in general. To David's question about what am I load testing? I'm load testing everything that I can affect. If I need to first find out that a system is running with, what is it going to chew up more? CPU, disk, memory, network, one of those four. And then I would tell somebody, here's why it's chewing up that resource. And is that okay with you? Yeah, in production, we got tons of memory. Great. Not going to throw a red flag on that one at all. But if all of a sudden you're like, hey, this thing is quite a CPU hog. I can only get 20 transactions per second, and it's at like 80% CPU on a single node, and you only have 15 nodes in production, I don't think we're going to make it. Then you start a different conversation. So it's not that you're testing for a specific physical resource. It's usually, hey, what do we need? How do we need to configure this to succeed in production? And one, how much is it going to cost us? Could be hardware, could be cloud resources. And what are the risks associated with it? So that's kind of the way I think about what I'm sort of testing as an objective for load. The other thing you might do in early planning, and early load test planning, there's a lot around non-functional requirements. And I don't really like the abstraction of that. One of the questions I often ask in the beginning of a load test project is, are there any really hard, like meaning steadfast, known limitations? Like, we only have 14 licenses for that.
Well, wait.
We can't get any more.
Hold on. I want to roll back a second, right? Because
Yes.
when you say I want to test all the things, all the things I have access to, and are there hard limits? I still have the question of, how do I isolate the network from the database, right? How do I test a thing independently? And how do I know I'm not just waiting on the space of the internet for my test to respond? And how can I isolate what I'm trying to test?
Yes. If I stop my share and I go there, did that work? It worked.
Yes.
Two different ways to look at this. If I have, and it's a purple pen on purpose. If this is my system under test, and on the back end, I have a database of some kind, and then I have another web service cloud over here. If I look at the core capabilities of CPU, memory, network, disk, and that's there, and let's say my traffic actually comes in, goes through a load balancer, and this is just one node of and JMeter would be over here, right? So I have traffic coming in to hit this scenario.
Yep, this looks right.
JMeter is responsible for creating the traffic in some workload fashion. Could look like production, could look like more generic, like 10 transactions per second, just really simple. The monitoring of the system under test could be from an APM tool, a Dynatrace, or it could be from the operating system monitor. Like if you're in Linux, you might use HTOP. HTOP is a common one. You might set up InfluxDB. You might have a monitoring agent, telegraph into Influx. And then you take your JMeter results and you put them into Influx, and that all comes out into Grafana. And you combine the physical monitoring of the system under test with the metrics of the load from the front end, and you overlay them. And that's exactly what I do, and I will show it to you. So
One more clarifying question. One more
I was going to say,
go ahead.
I was going to say, when I test for all the things, if this is a big question mark, meaning I know I'm going to generate some load, but I don't even know how it's going to impact the database, all this other stuff.
Right.
Sort of the first test is like, let's just explore and figure out what we need to know. It's like, hey, there's a whole other system out here we didn't even know that's a dependency. And you're like, oh my gosh, okay, so that could be a limiter. And maybe there's things we don't know. So I don't usually go in saying I need to test for network or I need to test for memory. I'm sort of testing to make sure the end user or the workload will succeed. What I learn about network, memory, CPU, disk, and these unknown unknowns, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns, that's really just part of the peeling away the layer of the onion in the process. The first few tests are very exploratory. And then you're like, all right, now we know to hit our 100 transactions per second, we probably need 4 of these systems, and we need 200% resources for database. Then we get to like, now let's run 100 transactions per second. Great. What will it take to get 200 transactions per second? What's our future look like? So as you evolve running the load, it starts very exploratory and progresses towards, now that I really know what resources are going to get hit. Because you start out, you don't know. Maybe it is a network hog. Maybe it's a memory hog. Who knows? Yeah.
So let me see if I can both ask and interpret your response here, because I think you did answer this a little bit. So JMeter needs access to the DB to build its transactions question. And the answer is, I think, no. I don't need direct database access in order to load test it. What I need is to know how the application uses the database. So I need the HTTP call that hits that database. Yes?
It depends.
Okay.
But it's very simple. If you think of JMeter in simple fashion, it just generates load. And then let's say in this example, it's doing HTTP requests. And I have a third tool over here, maybe it's Influx and Telegraph and Grafana, to monitor the system under test. One of the things I might monitor is a database, right? Maybe that's a SQL database or an Oracle database. So JMeter is not doing this monitoring, but it actually can. It does. There are plugins in JMeter for 2 interesting things that David asked. One, JMeter can send SQL calls. So let's say you bypass all of this middle stuff. JMeter could load test the database directly. Then JMeter, if you're going to send ODBC requests or JDBC requests from JMeter into an Oracle database directly, you need to have, JMeter needs to be because you install your JMeter like right on a machine right next to the database, and it would connect directly. And that is a totally valid approach. There are also, in addition to the samplers for JDBC, in JMeter, there are plugins to do like monitoring the system under test, just kind of does like perfmon, rudimentary rstat or something like that. So there could be a need, rather than having all of this fancy stuff, you could have JMeter talking to the database and pulling those stats in there. So if you wanted to do a purist, JMeter only is my only tool, I have to generate all the right loads. That is a valid question. And then I will tell you, as much as that's completely valid, I haven't had to do that for about 15 years.
It's more of a secondary test you might be doing. You usually would want to do it the way the application would handle it.
Yep, and not invalid. It is an advanced thing. The other part from SQL, the other thing you'll see is sockets. So if you have actual like straight up TCP, UDP, if you had actually sockets as a low level request, again, JMeter is boring at that point. You have to be an expert in sockets. Like same thing with SQL, like JMeter doesn't have anything special, but you kind of got to be an expert in SQL. Whereas with HTTP and HTTPS, because it's so far towards the presentation layer, usually that can be much more simple in terms of correlation and stuff like that. So yeah, not completely invalid as a question, David, but you would, if you were doing this type of scenario where you were testing directly to the DB and it was your only way to monitor the DB, then yes, you would have to ask for some permissions to get JMeter to do that connectivity. If you're running web load on the front end, there's a chance you don't need that access. But David, here's my tip. Somewhere, somehow, someone is monitoring that database. So versus you trying to do it yourself, my advice is make a new friend. There's a smiley person over here, who's like, hi, I'm your admin or your SRE or even a DBA. Like these could be really happy, shiny people who you can collaborate with. And now not only do you have help with monitoring, but if you ever find a bug back here, you have a friend to help you escalate that. And that's a big win that has nothing to do with JMeter. But building relationships is all about solving problems. And you'll find people back here who are paid to make sure problems never happen. So you're leaning into the fact that you're like, hey, I think I found something. You want to look at this? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thanks for bringing that for me. I had one of those this week. We had one that started 3 weeks ago. And just this week, someone went, huh, wait a minute, that's not supposed to, and they found like a major issue. So that can be very exciting to do that as well. Cool. All right. Was that, first of all, was this picture scribbly enough for you guys? I didn't get, there's no blue in here.
I take it. Yeah. Well, the blue and the purple are pretty close.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
I got you. All right. The first thing we'll go into, I want to cover a little bit about, this is a great conversation, by the way. We could go for hours. Let's talk a little bit about one of the first things you do from a simple JMeter script into a more complex JMeter script. And that is modules and thread groups. I'm going to go and share here. And Susan, if something else pops in the chat here, if I didn't answer someone's questions, just let me know.
I will interrupt and cow it up.
All right, so you should be seeing some kind of a screen here with some stuff. Some stuff, right? Yep. Yeah. And this, we're playing around in Mark's pre-prod environment. So just so you're aware, I now have, I think, 130 terabytes to play with. So if you guys want to query some PCI data, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I just took my compliance training, so I'm supposed to say, no, thank you very much. I shouldn't have so everything you're seeing here is test data. So if we think about a simple JMeter group, I may throw in a thread group and say, this is my thread group. I'm going to run 10 threads. I'm going to ramp up for 60 seconds. You guys get the idea, right? Something. And if I don't run infinitely, let's say I'm going to run for 1,000 things. And then maybe I have like some duration. I'm going to run that whole thing. Forget that. I'm going to run for 300 seconds and a startup delay of 0. And then I might throw under here a simple sampler just for an HTTP request. And I call something like perfectbytes.com, right? HTTPS 443. And I can put in something simple, listener. Let's just look at the view results tree. And let's see. Yeah, I should save my test plan, shouldn't I? That's fine. There you go. I have no idea whether this is going to work. Hey, look, it's working. Isn't that nice? And I'm hammering my website. So we've got something simple, but the question might be the real logic of my test. The only request I'm doing, let's say I change this to request A, B, C, and I start growing this out. Oop, come on, where'd you go there? A, B, C, D. All right. And I might want to look at the other plugins that I can put in here for listeners. So if you haven't added in the JMeter plugins, you've got all these great things like transactions per second. Oh, that sounds good. I have a throughput goal. Another advanced thing you might get into doing is saying, all right, well, I need some assertions. Maybe there's a response assertion around a response code. Let's say we'll do, response code, and we'll add, it should be a 200. Right, done. So I have a response assertion. One of the other more advanced things you can do if you really want to commit to it is a response time, a duration assertion that says this thing should take n number of milliseconds. So those requests should only take 1,000 milliseconds. But one of the reasons I think this is really important and overlooked commonly, like functional testers get it, pass fail assertion, we live and eat and breathe, like that's our world. Performance testing, we're like, if I can just get some load running, then I'm going to go look at my back. I'll figure out whether we passed or failed once we get to the big load. And we forget to go back and say, if I'm running this on every build, every night, all the time, and if I looked at the graph every night, it's kind of always around 700 or 800 millisecond response time on average. Great. Well, why don't I commit to that? Why don't I commit to that by putting a duration assertion right in the script that says, if you ever go over, let's say 1 second, like I just put here, then absolutely throw a failure on the test. Something else has gone wrong. It might just be a false positive. It might be like, oh, we ran out of CPU. Oh, there was something else happening on the box. That's fine. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Like you failed the test, but we know it wasn't the app. But what about that one time it comes through? It's like, somebody changed the caching algorithm because this thing is taking way longer to run than it ever did before. Wow, it's taking 3 seconds, but it took 3 seconds perfectly for the 15-minute load test we did on the nightly build. Duration assertions, very, very cool. So let's say I get that going, but somebody says, outside of your nightly test, you're just running a baseline that, you ramp up, you run, it works, but I want to run some different scenarios. Let's say I want to run a scale test that ramps up 3 times, like 1x, 2x, 3x, and that's a bigger load test. Well, do something like this. Like I'll save this and I'll show you guys kind of how I've solved this for myself, and then we can look at all the examples that are built into this. One of the core modules in our world is called Freeway, which does all of the work. And you'll notice the goofiest thing here is that I have 3 different thread groups. And I have 3 thread groups so that I can actually schedule thread group 1 to run 50 transactions per second, and then have a startup delay on schedule 2 to add another 50 transactions per second, and then schedule even later thread group number 3 to have another 50 transactions per second, maybe even schedule later than that, group number 4. Now I have 200 transactions per second total. And it actually stepped up 50 transactions per second over the course of an hour. So every 15 minutes, I'm adding another 50 TPS. If you did that with the throughput shaping timer that comes on a single thread group, it's actually, you're kind of stuck with the way that the throughput shaping timer manages its resources. And if you're doing things at 5,000, 6,000 transactions per second, the JVM doesn't really work very well for the throughput shaping timer. So I switched to use 4 different thread groups to make that happen. Now, the first advanced feature that allowed me to go here so easily was something called modules. So you'll notice this is called a module controller, and the name of it is samples, and you can find target elements. And in this case, I use what's called a test fragment that's called modules. So I can share the same JMeter code across these 4 different thread groups. So you see the thread groups are really simple. Like there's nothing in there. And so when I tell thread group 1 to do something, I don't have to, I can reuse my code. You use include controllers, another feature within JMeter. And I think it's a config element. Is it, no, is it a thread? It has to be in a thread group, doesn't it? So you can use, it's a logic controller called an include controller. Yeah. So an include controller is like a module controller, but you can actually give it an external JMX file. So let's say I pulled in a whole different JMX script to include in the test plan. You could do this same thing, but you'd have a totally separate JMX file that's shared across scripts. And since I sort of do everything in one JMX to keep things simple, I use the same concept. I use a sampler. I use a module controller and a test fragment. And then under here, I start with some test setup and I go into my transactions. You could see these are my naming for different transactions and that kind of stuff, right? So you advance your game because you can do more flexible scenarios with these 3, 4, 5 different thread groups. As you do those advanced scenarios, you then move the actual investment of your time in scripting, correlation, data parameterization. Here, I've got a whole bunch of like data setup stuff for random data. Well, I only have to work those things out once, and then I reuse that across the other thread groups. Again, similar to throughput shaping timer, but I found some throughput limitations within how the throughput shaping timer governed threads in the JVM world. So that was one issue. So that's one way that you can start stepping up your game, is having these different ways of using modules. Another technique you could have is submodules. So you could have thread groups 1 and 2 call module A, and you could have thread group 3 and 4 call module B, and you're running traffic for A and B in parallel. So it's a way to stay within a single JMeter instance and not have to juggle around the repo. If any of you have ever lived at the base JMeter scripts, hang on, come on, buddy. It's gonna type ahead there. If you've ever looked at a JMeter XML file, it can be really, really annoying. So
it's really hard to version control too, doesn't it?
There's freeway MX. Come on, buddy. My VM is being really slow today. I don't know why. And hopefully that's going to come back and give you this funky XML. So it really wasn't designed for the repo. It doesn't play nice in a repo because it's technically not actually valid XML. Plus all the data values in your payloads and stuff are a kind of a pain in the butt to look at. So I got to the point where I'm like, if I'm gonna have to suffer the JMeter GUI, I'm gonna try to get all my job done in a single instance of JMeter, not juggling 3 or 4 instances with 3 or 4 GUIs to try to get the I've been this module for this and that module for that and this script for that. I kind of try to keep it all in a single script. Again, the second point for me is once you get advanced in your JMeter, it's like, I need to be more efficient at this because I'm doing more load testing. If somebody says, hey, can you tweak this? I'm going to launch the JMeter once, I'm going to edit the thing once, and then I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to mess around with a bunch of other stuff. Other tools, I'm also a fan of the K6 tools written in JavaScript. If you're in Gatling and you're using Scala, hey, that's more like a programming language that really is nice in a repo. In an IDE, boy, you can program in there and it makes sense. The IntelliSense makes sense. The coloring makes sense. Everything is much easier in a scripted type of language. So modules are opened up the door for me to start reusing stuff and coming up with a single JMeter instance that can do more flexible scenarios, not just run one thread group, do your thing. The throughput shaping timer is great if you're doing very small amounts of load, but I had found there are limitations even in Java 11 that if you haven't seen the throughput shaping timer, you can check it out. The second thing, and let me scoot over here to make sure I'm looking at, as you're getting to the point where you're not running every JMeter test by hand, and you're starting to run things unattended. Maybe you have it on a Jenkins pipeline. Maybe you put it like I do behind Rundeck. You'll want to use command line parameters. And the way I define them is using this parameter function piece at the top of the script of the test plan. And you can define user-defined variables. The interesting thing about user-defined variables is they get set once when the script is instantiated, and then that's what they are. So when you submit to launch this script, you can use this funky look up this parameter function. It's like all the functions in JMeter are $, blah, 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 blah. Use that P function, which says, hey, somebody on the command line has handed in a parameter called slow %, and give it an integer. Or how many of the credit, like let's see in this thread, there's one here called credit service. And so I put a throughput controller and I put a credit % as a throughput piece. And I can actually pass in of all the iterations, what % should issue a credit, because we're a financial gateway. I have testing some bad requests. We have people that send in crappy, they'll get a 400 error. So I have a couple payloads that are intentionally gobbledygook. Bad request. So what percentage of the mix do you want to do that? So if I go to look up bad request, again, there's a throughput controller. I pass in that %. So some interesting things, a way to pass in from the command line, take the same script, but affect what it runs from the outside. And you could do that from the command line, like even me issuing this pre-prod, and I said, what environment are you running? I'm pointing at pre-prod. Well, that environment variable is actually set here if I ran it on the fly to do that. So you can use the logic, and the best example of this is look at all these ones that are prefixed by G1, and that would be thread group 1. Now it's my cryptic naming, but I got used to it. And after a number of years, the people that came to work with me, they didn't complain. Maybe I hope we had open and transparent communications and trust of one another, but it's like, yeah, group 1 threads, group 1. Oh, look at that. Looks exactly like the same fields of threads, ramp up, number of loop count, duration, startup delay. So the cool thing about that is I can make from the outside, I can make thread group 1 do whatever I want. And I'm going to do let's see if I can get back. I can actually pause the sharing. And does that, no, that pauses the whole screen. I'm going to stop the sharing again. I'm going to show you this. So in order to do the simple load test of ramp up and load, I would just do one thread group with the settings to take you from like 0 to 100 users. And it's going to slowly ramp up over 300 seconds and run for, 1 hour, right? Simple kind of thing. If I were going to do, like I said, a scale test, right? Ramping up like that. So I could actually have this be thread group 1 and it runs the entire time. And then a delay for thread group 2 and it runs for 75% of that time, 3/4 of the time. Thread group 3, it runs half of that. And thread group 4, the last one to show up, would be the last 20 minutes. So I would do, here would be like 50, 100 transactions per second, 150, 200. I could even do a spike test. So I take what is thread group 1 and I have it run that 1x load for, let's say, an hour, 1 hour, right? So this is 1 hour run. And then I have thread group 2 that in the middle of this goes from 0 and adds a huge spike up to like 6x. And then it ends. So I have a delayed start. And then this big spike of the exact same traffic from the exact same script happens with thread group 2. So I can combine those two. And then my test cases are, we are able to run successfully 1x. We see how we do at 6x. And then we should be able to return and recover to a 1x load over here and the denouement. So you could use, again, if somebody came to you and said, hey, you have your JMeter script, how do I configure this? Well, I need to open it up and run, I need to reconfigure that. And you're doing custom JMeter scripting for the one-off time you had to do that. Well, there's the warning. I stopped thinking about one-off load testing a long time ago. I'm like, hey, how often should we run this spike test? What do you mean? Well, I'd like to run it like once a week. Oh, okay, great. I'm going to use the efficiency of the modules and the variables and stuff so that I can configure the exact same jobs and have 3 different scenarios doing the same kind of thing.
Hey, Mark, we got a question.
Yeah, great.
So on those parameters, can you set default values for those parameters?
Yeah, let me show you that. I'll go back into sharing here for a second. There we go. Ready? So the default values in the P function are like this one, like for G1 ramp up, the default is 60. And it works kind of like, it's very similar to Bean Shell or Bash, sorry, where you can define a variable and give it if you don't set it, here's the default. So if I pass in G1 ramp up from the command line, I will use the value that came in from the command line. If on that P function, if there wasn't one defined in the arg, well, in Java, it's an argv argc, right? If it didn't come in on the command line args, then use this default value. So you can see a couple here, like I have a default host. So that's, going to hit pre-prod. I have a default, so some default scenario is a standalone scenario, the path to the data file. So you can see some stuff about how that thing is running and where it gets its data from doing so. Yeah. So yeah, you can do default.
About the containerization personally, and about running your containers and like accessing things that are happening in the container. It was on your agenda and I'm excited for you to get there.
Yeah, we can take a leap because it relates very much so to command line parameters. Let me see, since you guys are looking at that, let me see if I can do that. And it's Wilson Mar, JMeter, Docker. Yeah, just before is the guys that did it. And they'd have look for a JMeter, Docker JMeter image. And it's the GitHub itself is docker-JMeter. And I think, let me see if they put the link in here. It does have the security patches and stuff, but the Novatech guide on how to pass command line parameters through a JMeter test plan is exactly the same thing I just showed you guys. There are some other parameters for doing that. If you scroll down to look at how they're doing that, when you run Docker, if you type Docker run, you can actually, outside of any Docker specific options, it will just pass the command lines for that run command into the containers init script. So if the init script for the docker-jmeter container, that image, is really just when you fire up this image, I am going to call JMeter. So in their JMeter hub, I think it's under the test or the entry point. Yeah, sorry. So in their custom JMeter entry point, if you look in there, they are calling JMeter. That's where it actually gets called. If you have any extra arguments that gets passed in, so there's extra args and Ps, so you can pass in command line parameters to the entry point. And then of course, here's the other things as example that are commented out. The -n is running in non-GUI mode, just run in the background. The -t is a path to the JMX file. The -l is where do you want me to log the results, usually called a JTL file. That's where the L comes from. And then you might have, here's another parameter, like I'm doing RMI, here's my server host name, here's my other local port. So these are just examples of how to actually pass standard command lines. But then the two down here are custom command, like -D command lines. Now, the way I do that in my own stuff is I have a job. This thing is still running. I want to make sure it's still running. So this is a test that's running. You're looking at Grafana, as it's called from JMeter, and it's been humming along. It's doing a little smoke test. Again, I just got that built. So this script for the JMeter script that you guys just saw is called Freeway Requester. And if I go take a look at Freeway Requester, this is Rundeck you're looking at. And I have a whole bunch of really cool fields and parameters. You could do this in Jenkins. You could do this in Octopus even as a deployment. You could do this just from command line, from a shell script. And JMeter gets called from rundeck. And here, does this look familiar? Look at these G1 threads. Look at all G1 thread, G4 thread. Look at all these options that I'm parsing out of rundeck. And actually all the way down here towards the bottom, look at that. I have all of these -J and -D options that get passed in to J, and here's no hub, JMeter, whatever. Now I'm just doing this from rundeck on a shell script. You could just change this same script to be like, this isn't going to be JMeter. I would no hub Docker run JMeter Docker. And I could pass the exact same thing. And now it's going to tell Docker to run JMeter. I don't call JMeter directly. And so that's how, like, absolutely seamless from somebody who's uses JMeter with command line parameters. If you want to switch to Docker, it would run. It's not fully tested for this script, just in the way it passes things through. But when in the other testing I had done, it's like totally seamless. Now, I keep two things in mind. There are some limitations around actually running JMeter in Docker. One, a Docker image in a Docker container, if you have to expose ports in order to do stuff in and out of that container, the Docker image, it chews up lots of resources in terms of memory to launch all of those network interfaces. So hopefully you're just doing outbound communication. You're not opening a bunch of ports for access. That should typically be it. The other thing is, your company may not allow you to have open, wild, hey, just bring in any Docker image you want. My company parses everything through an Artifactory gateway. So we can get to Docker images, but if it's not on the approved list, you may have to jump through that. So there are some things around governance that might hit you. But technically, it works just fine. I have not run, this script will run, a single instance of this script will run 1,000 transactions per second. 1,500. So that's a lot more. So 1,500. I haven't run that outside of a raw Red Hat running Java JMeter. I haven't run that much throughput from a JMeter engine in Docker. So that could be something you learn as well. So yeah, and I'm not sure if on that machine, I don't know that I had Docker. Let me take a look. If this is,
I'm just going to get up on the time. We are about at an hour. So I want to make sure we have time to field any like spontaneous questions that come up. And, you know, we could talk JMeter all night, but want to make sure we give space. So I'm going to let you finish your thought now.
Yeah, I'm ready. So hopefully that gives just a little bit of insight how it's not that much different from running JMeter at the command line that you would run JMeter at the command line to run in Docker. The caveat I will say is, how do you're going to pass the JMX from the repo. You're just going to, instead of it being JMeter, it would be Docker run JMeter. That's the only difference. From a functional perspective, the way that, and they did a really nice job, and there's great information if you head out to this just before JMeter, not after JMeter. It's pretty good.
Yeah, I feel like it's just after JMeter. You know,
Docker
did technically come after JMeter because JMeter came after Apache in the timeline.
I'll go over whatever you guys will want to see. The next thing I wanted to show you was the fact that there used to be some interesting listeners. There's something you'll find in JMeter world called the backend listener. For me, I let JMeter run and spit everything out to a JTL file. In fact, if I go to this guy, if I go to mount data logs. So here's some examples when JMeter is running in the background. These are some old results that I have. I set up an agent, which is like called Telegraph from InfluxDB, and it listens to these folders. 2, 7, 8, 4. Yeah. So it listens to that folder for anything called star.jtl, and it sucks in that information from the command line. So when I run a script on that VM, it actually pulls up the JMeter samples and puts them into InfluxDB. And then the InfluxDB goes and grabs them and puts them in this lovely graph the way you see them here. And so the same JMeter script, you'll see the transaction 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hey, look, we've completely screwed something up. Something's gone really terrible back there. Isn't that nice? We are running, and it's just, we're smoke testing after our database refresh. So this is probably data file problems. But this is just my simple, I didn't choose purple. That's nice. But just very simple dashboard for the health of a JMeter script running in Grafana. So you've got Grafana pulling data from Influx, JMeter is writing to a file, and that file is getting picked up. I run all of this stuff. You can run it in a single VM. You can the Grafana is Dockerized, the run deck is Grafana Dockerized, the InfluxDB is Dockerized. My two pieces of top advice, if you're getting to advanced JMeter backend listener graphing stuff, is there's overhead. So if you have an excessive high throughput running 1,000 transactions per second into that JTL file, you're going to overload your load runner or your load generator pretty quickly if you have to ingest. So you want to keep your ingestion really simple. So I use a data type. If I look at Influx, and hopefully, yeah, this will get me in. So come on, we'll go in here. If we look at data coming from Telegraph, if I look at the very, very bottom of this configuration, you'll notice I pull in a timestamp. This is the grok patterns for a JMeter sample. And a lot of them are data type, meaning no transformation. It's not trying to do data conversion on the Telegraph agent. It just pushes it over to Influx and says, it's data, good luck. If you want to convert it during querying, that's where you pay the price, but you don't want to add overhead onto your load generator while you're doing that. Also, if you look in JMeter, and let me go back over here. If you look in JMeter, there are backend listeners. So if I go to listener and you've got the backend listener, they've written a whole bunch of cool stuff that can talk to Influx and talk to Prometheus. There's Graphite. Here's the raw database backend that supports UDP. If you want to ask JMeter, whose job is to run transactions, hey, will you also do all of this crunching and send it over to this other tool? It works. It works, and it's very convenient if you're just getting started with this and you don't have admin access to set up all these other APM type tools and things. So just be aware, as you add more frequent and you run more load, the listeners tend to have some overheads. You'll see a lot of places, hey, I can't run enough throughput on my JMeter. One of the things they say is, how many listeners have you enabled? So like I would go through after a run and automatically disable these listeners so that really JMeter's job is run load and do it with all my smart logic, but don't waste your time. I'll figure out how to asynchronously parse all those results.
So that gives me that strikes me as a question. Would you rather look at the data on a listener on a tree, or would you rather look at it from the monitor that's directly on the devices you're testing? So if I am hitting a web server, is it better to monitor the response time and like map that out versus what the performance of the server is experiencing from processor and what threads groups are doing what on the actual host?
Yeah, for me, if I'm working on, let's say, let's spend some time fixing up the script so it does what my internal customer wants it to do, or what I want it to do. I will turn on, like here I have a response time listener. I will turn on a transactions per second. And this is sort of scripting smoke test, get it working. And I can see, like, if I actually ran this, I think it'll run. It'll start giving me rudimentary logs that you would normally see in JMeter. And if those are pretty good, and if I'm collaborating with somebody else, I can I remember shooting screenshots to one gentleman and he was like, what are these pictures? They look different. You don't send, I'm like, yeah, I'm just working in JMeter right now to get the script working and work out the logic. And then when we start running the actual test, Then I flip over and run it in the harness with Rundeck and Grafana. And I start sending him screenshots that look like this. He's like, oh, that's what I expect to see. So it depends on who you're sharing it to. And for me, these dashboards are also really great for aggregation at query time. So if I'm running a load test, a small load test at 4 a.m., I will use the visualizations from Grafana and the other tools, because it's easier to go back and show that snapshot image. If I get up first thing in the morning and I see, it looks like the load test was slower than usual, you go into that tool and you can query it. If I'm doing something in real time with a customer, let's say nowadays we're doing it through virtual Zoom or whatever, it's a collaborative call where, hey, I'm running something, DBA is running something, whatever, we're all collaborating. I'll usually use at first just the raw JMeter listener. The two other things I'll tell you is when I hit stop here, this data, which just started showing a few transactions, is temporary. If I close JMeter, I lose that unless I figure out how to save a JTL file on my desktop. It's gone. Anytime
I may have learned that the hard way.
Yeah, well, I have too. But there's ways to say that, right? You can actually have a file name. There's a file writer. There's a listener that will save your JTL file, even though you're running in GUI mode. So there's ways around it, but it's very my desktop, my machine. I'm a single person doing the work. If you're working in a team, which most of us are, I very much so prefer punting this over to a time series database where everyone can self-service log in. Hey, Mark, I know you're looking at that spike down here. Did you look at this one? And they share another screen. It's like, great, that's fine. We can all sort of self-service and collaborate and look at interesting things. So that's an advanced way to say we're using JMeter, but we're really using these additional tools to make the whole process work much better.
So I have another question about the difference.
I'm surprised.
Okay, you're surprised?
Yeah, really, I'm surprised.
So would you rather run staging testing, or would you rather run production testing for your performance?
Oh, right now, everything I'm doing, it depends. The most favorite things I've done, and I can stop sharing for a second just to put myself back on the screen. The most fun I've had is doing gigantic load tests. So reaching 2 million browser sessions in a load test globally, hitting a distributed system, was rather invigorating. That was cool. But the truth be told, we didn't actually learn much about specific code optimization, specific anti-patterns. Like, do you need more load generators, or do you need more load balancers? Yep. Do you need more network? Yep. Okay, give me 10 more of those. And those are interesting problems for infrastructure people who are like, I built a huge system. Yeah, but it's still like, I have a huge truck. It's still just a truck. I mean, it's cool that it's big. Like, you see the big machines thing on the cable TV. It's cool, but it's still just a truck. I mean, we just made it really big. So for me recently, you have to learn how, like, in your journey as a performance engineer, all right, have I learned macro tuning like that? How do I do the calculations pretty quickly around, all right, I've got 10 gig connections, and that means one is reserved for this, or I have 4 10 gig, and you start doing the math to figure out how much you need additional or under, whatever. And those are big numbers, but you learn how to get along. I'm working at 100 terabytes in a database or more. All right, what do my volumes look like? How do I lay out physical disks? That's infrastructure type testing that you would get to tuning in production. Exciting, totally awesome. But after you've done that enough, you're like, I know exactly the 5 things that we might have to fix. I got the joy of fixing one of them, and then the project was over. All right, I mean, that's cool. And for me now, it's helping everyone learn how to do this. Shifting left is a totally fun thing, because you're finding, like, hey, I got this caching algorithm we're going to use Redis. So I put Redis in there and it performs horribly, even at, 10 users. Okay, what did we do wrong? Our code isn't built to take this particular whatever. So code anti-patterns for performance, it's a different way of thinking and learning how to tune at the micro scale for thread blocking, thread contention, especially if you're getting into asynchronous programming, like task-based programming using Java futures and sort of what does a future latch onto when it's no longer a thread? It's an event. It has an ID as an event. Am I talking to a socket anymore? Who owns that socket? So there's some really interesting things that happen in the micro when you're running 10 threads concurrently in the same 10 millisecond time slice. So I'll say there are benefits and joys about learning each. And it helps to actually grow your skill to identify the modality. I should be in big system tuning suggestions, what I'm listening, the context for what I'm learning and what we're monitoring should be big system thinking versus, hey, I'm talking to developers and testers at micro scale. I should shift my language. I should ask different questions at smaller scale. It's equally exciting.
Well, so my last question is, somebody's going to have a follow-up. They're going to want to know how to reach out to you and ask their JMeter questions and geek out in great detail on these little problems.
Yes, I'm looking at the chat.
How do they get to you?
You can get to me, mark@perfbytes.com, wide open. We have a Discord server. If you go to the PerfBytes Twitter, you can go Twitter PerfBytes and get into our Discord. It's not super active, but people ask one question and then you get 25 threads going. Perf Bits is my single one-person show on Fridays. I take questions. Trisha Chitani, who's a great tester in our community online, asked a question around batch. And so I did a whole episode, 30 minutes on how to do performance analysis for batch ETL processes and stuff. It was totally fun. So I take just like tonight, if you have key questions and things you want to learn about, I can cover them on that stuff. It's always fun to join you guys. And we should all thank Susan for asking so many really good, those were really good questions. Totally on a thread. That was really good.
They're the questions I have about the projects we've been doing this month. All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us and for always being a fan of Tisca and for us being a fan of yours and letting us look at that, chief pharmacologist.
I totally missed my opportunity to put my Twitter handle up there.
There you go. There's
also URLs. There we go.
All right. All right.
Yeah. Got it.
Okay, cool. Well, we will see you at the next, like the next one is going to be our 4th annual. It's not your 4th event with Tisca, but it'll be your 4th annual event with Tisca next June, right? You're in? Can we get?
Yeah, you guys got to figure out what are we all chewing on? What am I? I don't know what I'll be chewing on when I get there. I will tell you one of the side things I don't get to talk about much publicly is tuning our encryption algorithms that get put under NDA and also under scrutiny from if you create a crypto algorithm and the NSA doesn't know how you did it, you end up in trouble. I don't know if you guys know that, but it's not really trouble with it's not a capital T trouble. It's sort of a, hey, I found this really cool way to do this just crypto faster. And they're like, really? Would you like to share us some of that info?
Can I request that for Tisca 2024? If you make something and you can't explain it to the NSA, they get mad.
Yeah, he's in the woods. And Jen has not had internet for all night. And so she has load tested her internet and
local router. Yeah.
Also, the roof blew off my quail enclosure, so they got all wet. They were very sad.
It's not that's an analog world problem.
Well, Mark, I need to hit you up later and get your address because I have a gift for you to say thank you.
Thank you.
I know that you're typically like a Kentucky guy, but you're gonna get a little Durham love.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much, as always. Yeah.
Well, thank you for recording it. Hopefully it lands in the place we want it to. Okay.
I will stop the recording. And at this point, since we lucked out, you can turn yourself into the host.